let's be honest, in the majority of schools that I've ever worked with, the concept of wanting to harness innovation and encourage creativity, people finding new things to do or new ways of doing existing things is a really common theme that comes out in pretty much every school that I've worked with. So this divergent thinking is critical, and getting it right is really important. Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello, so this week we are going to be talking about divergent thinking. So divergent thinking is a stage in a strategic thinking process where you are intentionally creating lots of ideas without judging them. Now that final three words is really important, without judging them. And let's be honest, in the majority of schools that I've ever worked with, the concept of wanting to harness innovation and encourage creativity, people finding new things to do or new ways of doing existing things is a really common theme that comes out in pretty much every school that I've worked with. So this divergent thinking is critical, and getting it right is really important. So this week we're going to be diving into 3 top tips for how to kind of set the scene, if you like, for your divergent thinking. And then 3 questions that you can ask yourself, either as individuals or as a team, to generate that divergent thinking. Really quickly, before we dive into the detail, I want to make sure that you make the most of the time you invest listening to this podcast. And the best way to do that is to make sure you grab a copy of my free ebook, The Strategic Independent School Leader. It outlines how to answer the 6 essential questions that will clarify your school strategy and secure its future. In the world of business, strategy can be full of jargon, but it doesn't have to be that way. This is a jargon-free tool tailor-made to help private school leaders think and act more strategically. Download your free copy today at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/ebook. Okay, so if divergent thinking is all about creating lots of ideas without judging them, we need to set the scene for creating an environment in which that will happen. So there are 3 areas that I think you need to think about. The first is diversity of people in the room is really important. We've heard for many, many years now about diversity, and there has been extensive evidence within mostly the for-profit business world, admittedly. There's no reason it can't be true in schools as well. Evidence that the diversity of the types of people that you have in a room when you are either creating ideas or taking decisions, the more diverse the people in the room, the better the quality and the diversity of the thinking that you are creating. So if you want divergent thinking, you need to think about diversity of who is sitting around that table. Now, sometimes that can mean inviting people in for a particular meeting to ensure that you've got different groups represented around the table, maybe different stakeholder groups or different people with different experience and so on. And so that's a short-term fix, so it's just thinking about who's invited to the meeting. Often, though, this is a longer-term element that you need to be focusing on. Increasing diversity within governing boards, within leadership teams, within staff bodies for schools is critically important. And actually is a topic I want to cover in a future podcast episode in more detail. So putting that to a side for one moment, you want to create as much diversity in the room as possible. That's top tip number 1. So tip number 2, wherever you can, make sure that you try to separate the divergent thinking, which is this generation of ideas without judging them, from your convergent thinking. So convergent thinking is the second stage, where it's actually about decision making. It's all about being analytical, collecting evidence, making decisions around what you're actually going to proceed with and which actions you're going to take. What I often see, and I hear people report to me happening all the time, is that in meetings, people try to do the two things simultaneously, or at least at very, very close quarters. So there'll be a suggestion that we need some new ideas around a particular problem. And then what happens is one person will come up with a solution, a potential solution to the problem. That solution will be immediately judged around the table and then either accepted or dismissed. If dismissed, then the chair opens up for other ideas. But each idea is then judged on the fly as the ideas are generated. And what tends to happen in that case is one of a couple of things. Either the first idea is accepted. It might be the best idea to solve that problem. It's unlikely that just because it's the first idea that came out in the conversation, it's necessarily the best idea. What can also happen is that people stop generating ideas if they know they're going to be judged on the spot right there in terms of their ideas being shot down from across the table. So it tends to inhibit people from generating creative and innovative ideas. So the way to solve that is to separate your divergent and your convergent thinking within meetings. Now, for a small problem, it may be that you just separate it within one meeting. So you spend 4 minutes generating ideas and then 4 minutes making a decision and deciding which of those ideas are going to be pursued. Often, actually, it's a combination of ideas that have actually ended up being the one that's being pursued, because multiple ideas can converge into the best solution to the problem. Within a larger problem that's being solved, let's say you're talking about a whole strategic plan creation, generation, what I do is I separate into entirely separate meetings the divergent thinking from the convergent thinking. So depending on the scale of the problem, you can either separate it within the same meeting or into separate meetings, but either way, you want your divergent and your convergent thinking separately. If you're going to genuinely create good ideas and have that innovative, creative mindset around your divergent thinking ideation. So that's top tip number 2, separating those two forms of thinking. Tip number 3, you have to take action to make people feel safe. If you're asking people to create lots of ideas, you want them to be creating slightly wacky, slightly silly, out of the box, blue sky thinking, crazy ideas. Not because you're actually going to accept those crazy ideas and go with them, but because those slightly silly ideas beyond the boundaries of what you would normally talk about in a work meeting often spark new creative ideas that maybe you will be pursuing. So, for example, the example I often give for this one is, if you are trying to make people safe, then as a leader, you want to be creating some really quite out-of-the-box ideas first off. So let's say you're brainstorming the cover article for your next alumni magazine, and every year so far it's been kind of all of the same ilk, quite bland, quite conservative kind of coverage. You're looking to push your content into a slightly more innovative realm. Then maybe talking about all the silly things that you could have on that front cover. You know, we definitely need a clown on that front cover. That would be amazing. Do we have any alumni who are clowns? Like, realistically, you're probably not going to end up with a clown on the front cover of your alumni magazine, but maybe that sparks someone else thinking, actually, we need some fun in this magazine. It needs to be enjoyable to read. Maybe it's not the clown on the front cover, but maybe there's another way we can inject some fun. So making people feel safe involves role modelling as a leader. The idea that you can come up with wacky ideas, no one's going to judge them. It's all about thinking beyond the normal boundaries that you set yourself at work. And then making sure as a leader that you sit back. You don't want to dominate this conversation. You want others in the room to feel empowered to put their ideas up on the board. And at no point do you allow any of those ideas to be judged. The other way that you make people feel safe is by separating people from their ideas. So you're not judging the person who created the idea, when you do come to that convergent thinking stage and you are making decisions about what to pursue, the person is separated from their idea. And similarly, if you put an idea out in the room, you don't have to remain committed to that idea. It was just a random thought that passed through your head at that moment in time that you verbalised. That is it. You can disavow your ideas at any point during this divergent thinking stage. And hopefully what that does is it helps people to free themselves to just throw ideas out into the open as a team, as a group, and make sure that you are genuinely creating lots of ideas without judging them. So that's top tip number 3. You've got to find ways to make people feel safe if you're asking them to do this. And then as we wrap up, 3 questions that you can ask your team or yourself if you're doing this on your own to generate that divergent thinking. So 3 ways you can look at the problem. The first thing you can do is the problem that you've identified that you're trying to solve and ideate around, look at it from other people's shoes. So on your whiteboard or on your piece of paper, jot down a list of stakeholders, might be pupils, parents, alumni, staff, whatever those stakeholders are. Jot down a list of stakeholders and think from their perspective, what does this problem look like? What does the problem actually mean to those people? And therefore, what solutions might there be to that problem from those stakeholders' perspectives? We automatically do this kind of thing from our own perspective first, which is fine. Do yourself first, but then force yourself to put yourself in other stakeholders' shoes to look at the problem. The second question that you can ask your team is, how do other sectors solve similar problems? It's likely that you'll be thinking about how other schools solve similar problems, and that's important and that needs to be part of the discussion. Often that happens automatically, but push that further. How do sectors beyond education solve these problems? So whether it's to do with customer loyalty, customer journey, whether it's to do with messaging and communications, to do with social media, kind of crisis management, all of these problems that you have an equivalent in those other sectors. So plug yourself in. Each person in the team could plug themselves into 1 or 2 other sectors, maybe areas of hobbies or interests that they have anyway, maybe where their spouses are part of the other sectors, they kind of have an automatic tap into what's happening in those other sectors. Find ways to bring that information into the conversation, and that will help you to create a much more divergent thinking around how to solve your problem. In actual fact, interestingly, I find that that's one of the things that I do automatically. I love being really up to date with business thinking around, especially around things like customer journey, customer avatars, messaging, around that kind of area. And I often find that when I bring some of those other fresh perspectives of what's happening in business in those areas into a school discussion, it unlocks another way of thinking about the problem that they're solving. And it can be really, really helpful. So find ways that you can do that for yourself. And then the third question, think about what unusual knowledge or experience each person around the table can bring to this problem. There is a tendency that we leave a huge amount of ourselves at home each day we go to work. Every day we go to work, we want to take our whole self with us. That includes your hobbies, your previous jobs, other charities that you might either volunteer for or donate to, the newspapers you read, your general outlook on life, the way that you're plugged into social media and the information you're gaining that way. You have a unique journey through life, which means that you have perspectives and a knowledge and experience which is unique around that table. Every single person around that table should be encouraged to bring to the conversation things from well beyond the education sector, well beyond the traditional things we talk about at work, and apply them to the problem that you're thinking about. So maybe in a team session, there's a quiet 3 or 4 minutes at some point where actually each person thinks individually, independently about their previous careers, their hobbies, maybe input that they have around things that they've done outside of work. How do those give you a slightly different perspective or different fresh ideas around this problem that you're solving? And then come back together again as a team and share your thoughts. Now, that may be difficult to begin with, but once you do it a couple of times, you tend to find that it becomes second nature. You don't almost need that extra time to do the thinking because you are automatically bringing those sorts of thoughts and ideas into your conversations. So to wrap up this session, those are 3 tips around improving divergent thinking in your school. Make sure there's diverse people in the room. Separate your divergent thinking from your convergent thinking and make people feel safe. And then 3 questions that you can ask yourselves in a team meeting where you're trying to generate divergent thinking. Firstly, looking at the problem from other people's shoes. Secondly, thinking about how other sectors solve similar problems. And thirdly, thinking about the unusual knowledge or experience that you can bring to the conversation. I hope this has been helpful. I've often found that when I'm working with schools, divergent thinking isn't always something that people give a lot of time to. And so if you are trying to increase the amount of innovation or creativity or just a sense of being comfortable with change within your school, then having a focus on this divergent thinking stage can really be helpful to kind of supercharging your strategic thinking around certain issues. I actually have a podcast episode which I did a number of months ago now. It's actually episode 15, all those episodes ago, specifically around strategic thinking skills. And this is one of the 5 strategic thinking skills that I talk about in this episode. So if you're interested in expanding your knowledge beyond just divergent thinking into convergent thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking, and directional thinking, do check out episode 15 of the podcast as well. I love to hear your feedback. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there are any other topics you'd like me to cover. But that's it for this time. So have a strategic week. I look forward to talking to you next time. Bye-bye then. Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.